Welcome to Renegade Inc. After so many military blunders, NATO and neocon credibility is in tatters. Yet, their unhinged rhetoric continues and is supported by a doting corporate media. Vladimir Putin recently commented that the citizens of Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan and Yugoslavia have seen how peaceful NATO is. So, whilst these decimated countries try to rebuild, is it time for us to question the narrative fed to us by so-called Western humanitarians? Scott Ritter, great to have you back on the programme.
Well, thanks for having me.
Scott, every time you come on, you've been right. You were right about the police brutality in the US and how the police are militarily trained and shouldn't be. You were right about the Afghanistan withdrawal, it should be called debacle. Now we're going to talk about Ukraine. Can you cut through all the guff and all the rhetoric that we have to wade through and tell us what's really going on in the Ukraine? And answer this question: why is it that the US and the UK are more interested in what's going on in the Ukrainian border than they are on the southern border in the US or our own borders here in the UK?
Well, I'm not party to the internal deliberations that are taking place at 10 Downing Street or the White House. So, but what I can say is this, historically speaking, when democratically elected leaders are confronted with domestic problems, they oftentimes seek external distractions. I would say that Ukraine is the ideal external distraction, because you can create a narrative, and you see this in the mainstream media. It's a narrative of the heroic Ukrainian resistance against the evil Russian bear, but not just the Russian bear, Vladimir Putin in person. I mean, this man is Voldemort. He's the personification of evil, all that is bad in the world. He is impulsive, irrational. He acts on a whim. It's as if the Russian nation didn't exist. It's all wrapped up in the person of one. And this is how, unfortunately, in the UK and in the United States, stories are sold to the public. They're sold by a narrative built around perception, not reality.
Tell us what the reality is on the ground. I know you're not there, but you're a military man. You understand these moves. You understand the propaganda wars and the misinformation that goes on. From your viewpoint, what's really going on there? And why have you written that America couldn't defend Ukraine even if it wanted to?
Well, we couldn't. I mean, it's sort of a statement of fact. First of all, okay, you're asking me a military question, not a political question then. Back in, when I was in the military, I was part of what I call the finest military force the world has ever seen. And that's the U.S. military that existed in the mid to late 1980s. We were singularly focused on closing with and destroying the Soviet enemy. We're talking about an American military that had 213,000 troops deployed in West Germany, capable of reinforcing them with 300,000 troops. We had tens of thousands of tanks, artillery, aircraft, and we were trained to fight combined arms warfare using an air-land battle doctrine that had been perfected in thousands of hours of training, realistic training back in the United States. Today, we have barely 60,000 military forces in Europe, of whom probably only 20,000 are combat forces. The rest of them, are involved in logistics and command staff and fighting wars in Africa and Middle East and everything but ready to fight the Russians. The Russians, meanwhile, have come out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, come out of the Yeltsin debacle, and have emerged from, the difficulties from the Chechen War, from a war with Georgia where the Russian troops did not do so well in 2008. It was an embarrassment for Russia. And they have rebuilt their military. They have reconstituted large-scale combined arms combat forces, the 1st Guards Tank Army, the 20th Combined Arms Army. These are Cold War era forces that used to be deployed in East Germany, ready to punch across the border and fight NATO. Russia disbanded them because they said, we're not going to be fighting a ground war in Europe anymore. Well, guess what? You might be. So they reconstituted them. They are trained, equipped, organized, and have a doctrine to close with and destroy NATO. They've been training this way for close to half a decade now. Meanwhile, NATO and the United States have spent the last 20 years kicking down doors in Iraq and slaughtering goat herders in Afghanistan in a losing fight. We didn't even win that fight. We got beat. And now we evacuated, whatever you want to call what happened in Afghanistan. We retreated in defeat. It was a humiliation not only for the United States, but for NATO. And remember, it's not just the United States that can't fight this fight. NATO can't either. NATO and the United States are not equipped, trained, organized, prepared psychologically, physically, mentally to fight a war with Russia. If they did, they would lose. It would be a humiliation along the lines that the West has not, that the United States has not experienced. I mean, it would be something akin to what happened to France in 1940, what happened to Poland in 1939, what happened to Iraq in 1991. This is the level of defeat that would occur. So no, the United States is it can't fight the war. The generals know this, but the politicians can't admit this. What the politicians are saying right now is, let's send 3,000 troops. Really? You think the Russians view them anything other than speed bumps? Because that's all they are.
When you talk about the generals, you're absolutely scathing about the generals who've been decorated in Afghanistan. Basically, you were saying last time we spoke that it was a gravy train there, and these generals have come out looking like Christmas trees, heavily decorated, but having not done much at all. Aren't the generals aware of the analysis that you've just come out with?
Well, H.R. McMaster, who used to be, a prominent American general who gained fame in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's one of the Christmas trees we're talking about here. He spent some time at Fort Leavenworth, and in 2000, I believe, 15, published a study called the New Russia, the New Russian Military Threat, or something of that nature. And the study was amazing because it pretty much said the following: Russia will kill us all in a war. That was the conclusion. We're not ready to fight Russians. Right. They have overwhelming artillery supremacy, armor supremacy, electronic warfare supremacy. If we go to war against Russia today, our troops will be stumbling down their battlefield, deaf, dumb, and blind, and they'll just be surrendered. It wasn't just him that said this. In 2017, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which is the component, it's based in Italy, the component of the Rapid Deployment Force of NATO, did a study that said, we're coming out of this conflict in the Middle East because the 173rd was deployed frequently into Afghanistan and Iraq. We're coming out of this war unable to fight the Russians. We don't have the equipment. We don't have the training. We don't have the doctrine. We got nothing. And everything the Russians have is superior to us. We will lose this fight. So it's not that, they've been saying this in private to Biden. They've been saying this in public to the American people and to Congress. And we haven't done anything about it.
But what would the American people say if, because let's face it, and I've got to put this diplomatically, if we go to the American electorate and say, by the way, the generals know that if you start this fight, you're going to lose badly, surely the American people aren't going to take that very well. Is that diplomatic enough for me to say it that way?
No, I mean, it's very diplomatic. I'll tell you, it would be, for me, I'm infuriated. As a taxpayer, I contribute to a defense budget of $760+ billion a year.
So all this rhetoric is just augmenting profits for Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and all the arms companies. Is that the purpose of this?
That's what it's looking like, because it sure as hell isn't putting a combat-capable military force in the field. Not only are we being told we can't fight the Russians, we can't fight the Chinese. This is why you have to be careful. This is why American politicians have to spin and bluster and lie and create perception over reality. Because if they ever told the truth, there would be a revolt in the streets that made January 6th pale in comparison. And it should happen if the American people are being lied to in this state. $760 billion, and we can't win a war. When I was in the military, we could fight 2.5 wars and win all of them.
So back to your first point, which is, look over there. I know we're collapsing over here. We've got a political impasse. We've got a lame duck president, often doesn't know where he is. Same in the UK, Boris Johnson, failing and floundering. Is it as simple as that actually a big dust-up over there just is an easier option politically?
Well, I think actually both Boris Johnson and Joe Biden would prefer that there wasn't a big dust-up over there. First of all, let's understand that we're not driving this boat.
Who is?
Well, I would say that Ukraine is, and then Russia.
But not even President Zelensky wants to dust up.
Today he doesn't want to dust up because he's confronted, he's the boy who cried wolf, thinking there was not a wolf, and suddenly there's a damn wolf at his door. Zelensky has been saying for some time that it is the policy of Ukraine to reincorporate Crimea, to reoccupy, to get the Russians out. And he's spoken of, diplomacy. We want to achieve this diplomatically, but he's also told the Ukrainian people and the military that we will use all forces necessary, to include war, to get this done. We are not backing down from this whatsoever. And he said, this is why we need to join NATO. We need to join NATO so that we can achieve this militarily. I'm not making this up. This is his own words.
But NATO don't. But listen, NATO don't want him. NATO don't want Ukraine.
Except that NATO is trapped by its own rhetoric. It's a prisoner to the, to the principles of NATO. The notion that we have an open door policy. We have to let anybody who qualifies in. And if this poor European country called Ukraine says, oh, we want to be a member, we have to give that credence. So you don't. There's nothing in NATO charter that requires that at all. In fact, NATO is obligated, I think, under Article 10 of the charter to carefully evaluate any application to see how it impacts the overall security of NATO. Understand this, NATO. If you let Ukraine in, it's a suicide pill. Russia has been saying since 2008, since the Bucharest summit, NATO Bucharest summit in 2008, where they floated the concept of Ukrainian and Georgian membership. But Russia has been saying yet. In 2009, then U.S. Ambassador William Burns wrote a cable where he said, this is what the Russian position is, and we need to respect. Russia followed through in 2016, I believe, with a foreign policy statement that said the exact same thing. Hey, Ukraine is a red line. This is very important to us. Putin has repeatedly gone on and said, hey guys, I'm speaking over here, but you're not listening. And at some point in time, you got to understand that when you don't listen to me speak, I'm going to punch you in the face, because then you're going to listen. He did that from a nuclear standpoint by creating nuclear weapons that the West has to pay attention to. Suddenly arms control is cool in the West. Want to know why? Because Russia built weapons that scare the crap out of us. Now we have a situation where Russia's saying this Ukraine thing's a red line. Let's see, what scares you? The military. So I'm going to deploy the military on my own soil, but in a manner which, even though I'm saying I'm not preparing to invade Ukraine, any military professional will look at it and go, oh Christ, this guy can move across the border and take these guys out in a week. And there's nothing NATO can do about it short of a nuclear conflict, which is why, by the way, this is all very dangerous. Because if it ever did get to a war, the Russians would have to be careful about the scope and scale of their victory. Because if they did what they're capable of doing and crush and annihilate and wipe NATO forces off the map, the only option NATO has left is to employ tactical nukes, and then it's all over. You and I won't even be here. It will be crispy critters. The world will end. And the Russians know this. But the Russians are forcing the United States and NATO to listen, and guess what? It's working. It's working. Inside NATO and the European Union now are conversations that should have been taking place over the course of the past 10 years, but haven't, because the United States has said, don't worry about Russia. It's a gas station masquerading as a country. It's not real, man. Don't worry about it. Their military, they're not as good as they think they are. Yeah, they produce that tank, but they can only produce 4 of them. They got a couple airplanes. They can't only, well, guess what? The Russian military is real, and it's ready to kick your that's where we stand today. Russia is in control. This is a table set by Russia, a menu defined by Russia, and eventually the United States are going to have to sit down at the table and eat chicken Kiev. They think they're going to serve up a Texas T-bone, but they're eating chicken Kiev, man, because that's what the Russians say you're going to eat.
Michael Averko, welcome to Renegade Inc. Really great to have you on the program.
Thank you, sir.
Michael, we have heard in the first half about the military capacity and capability of Russia. We've also heard about Ukraine and their intentions, and we've also heard about NATO and the fact that they're not battle ready. And in fact, if any conflict broke out on this border, it would be pretty ugly scenes for NATO, the US, etc. Just give us the historical context, if you will, about this conflict and why we once again find ourselves in this position, poking the bear.
Ukraine has very much a sort of regional history. There's an area in the west of Ukraine, notably in Galicia, Volhynia, Transcarpathia, that was ruled by the Austrian Habsburgs, and before that, Poland. And when these people became part of the Soviet Union in 1940, they realized, there was a great cultural divide, and the western part of Ukraine is not comfortable with Russian speakers, Russian culture, and the same is true the opposite way, because a lot of these West Ukrainians developed an anti-Russian attitude. And I believe that when the Soviet Union broke up, the Western NGOs were very much influenced by this West Ukrainian component. And so when the West was strong in the 1990s and Russia was not as strong, this anti-Russian variant was getting an upper hand in Kiev, the capital. And what you have basically is a sort of culture clash. Among the West Ukrainians with an anti-Russian lean, they were complaining about Yanukovych's cultural minister being biased against them. But in the meantime, the person they had under Yushchenko was biased against a pro-Russian perspective. And now we have a clear anti-Russian bias as well. And this rubs the pro-Russian areas the wrong way.
With that sort of analysis, and the sort of frozen conflict within that, how then do you see a way through? And is that through diplomatic means? Is it through military means? Or is it through, is there another way of going to try and get unity and some kind of thawing of these warring factions?
Diplomatic is the way to go. The problem is the Kiev regime anti-Russian component. They want to have a totally anti-Russian Ukraine. But for Ukraine to exist, and Putin in his press conference said Crimea could have still been part of Ukraine. The problem is they have to understand that if it's going to maintain its communist drawn boundaries, they have to give a little. They have to understand the different regional component. But for them, the idea of federalism and autonomy is wrong because they feel the country is more likely to break up. But hello, the country is in the condition it is right now. And we do have this Minsk protocol, which the United States says they're committed to, but they're not really leaning on the Kiev regime to honor it. And the Kiev regime, even though they signed it, they have said no on certain terms. They don't want to go through with it. So that's the problem.
If this is a wicked problem from a diplomacy point of view, what is a sort of safety net measure that you could take to in some way smooth the way, in some way to get some sort of traction? Because again, back to it, this frozen conflict, no one wins.
Right, and I think in a way what's helping the situation, because I'm sorry to say the government in my country appears very clueless. When Lavrov presented to Blinken the Istanbul and Astana declarations saying that an expanded military alliance can't threaten another nation, Blinken reportedly just shrugged his shoulders. And we saw this cluelessness, if you may, when Blinken and Nuland approached the Chinese to openly be critical of Russia, and they should know what the Chinese answer would be. For openers, the Biden administration has dissed the Beijing Olympics with this diplomatic boycott, but also China said no on certain terms. Hello, how about getting the Kiev regime to do this Minsk protocol? It's a UN-approved agreement where the Kiev regime is supposed to negotiate for this greater autonomy. We are also seeing Russia talking to France and talking to Germany. In the United States, they try to cover for Biden that, he has the world behind him. But the reality is that it's quite the contrary. We had the Croat president, democratically elected. He said that, this is about American domestic politics. He was sort of insinuating that Biden's low poll numbers, he creates this problem, exaggerates it, it takes attention away from that. And so the less American involvement and greater involvement of others inside NATO, outside NATO, like the Chinese, I think will definitely help the situation and in a way kind of coerce the elites here who often are clueless to see reality, whether they want to admit it or not.
This idea that we heard in the first half about an open door policy for NATO, how is that the case? Surely every NATO member should be in agreement if there is to be a new member.
Yes, but as we've seen, there have been two waves of NATO expansion where despite Russian objections, they were able to get it through. And from a Russian standpoint, NATO is definitely an existential threat. When the Soviet Union broke up, Russia openly inquired about joining NATO, and that was met with astonished bemusement. But then when Poland and some others shortly thereafter sought NATO membership, it was justified and included blatantly inaccurate anti-Russian propaganda along the lines of Russia is an inherent threat to the West. NATO was created to keep Russia down. Russia lost the Cold War. Russia doesn't like NATO expansion. Too bad. And again, because it's to keep Russia down, Russia could never be in NATO. Now, this is bad history. Germany fought 2 wars against the West. Russia was allied with the West. When you go back to history, at times Russia was allied with the West against other Western countries. So this idea that Russia is an inherent threat is faulty. On top of that, NATO, whenever they have viewed conflicts like Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, it's been patently biased. And when you see their leaders, Jens Stoltenberg, his predecessor, and his foe Rasmussen, clearly anti-Russian, but then people tell me, calm down, they're just figureheads. And I say, fine, but what happens like the German naval commander? He says something to the contrary, that Putin should be respected. Crimea is going to remain a part of Russia, and there should be a greater concentration on China. He is forced to resign for saying that. So clearly, this is giving Russia a notice that this, and it's the most powerful military bloc in the world, it needs to be contained somehow for their own sense of security.
You touched on the fact that when politicians are doing badly at home, whether it be in ratings or having parties in Downing Street, what they do is they go and create a scenario somewhere else so they can distract from their own leadership failings. With this situation, when we know that militarily Russia is so far advanced, NATO is fractured, unable to fight really meaningfully, do you think that these politicians who are talking in this way genuinely believe their own rhetoric and are deluded? Or do you think they know deep down that actually, if this was to go off, as it were, then actually it would be catastrophic, not just for Europe, but for the world?
Some of them, it's the latter. Others, it's the former. And you touch on something that was evident recently with this New Jersey Senator, Bob Menendez. He clearly caters to the anti-Russian Ukrainian expat community here. And a lot of them are people who are American-born but of Ukrainian background, and their family have, a past with this extremist Stepan Bandera group. He recently talked about how Russians are going to come home in body bags in the event of Kiev regime-Russia war. Now, does this buffoon realize that in the unfortunate event of such a conflict, Russia's not going to be needing the most body bags? And, but, he's not challenged, and he's playing to a certain element that has disproportionate influence, and it's just simply allowed, unfortunately.
With the rise of social media, is it the case that we now really need to purge the newsrooms? Because back in the day, CNNs of this world were able to, during the Gulf War, for instance, Iraq War, they were allowed to have hold of the narrative and keep pushing it out. Rise of social media means that there are different narratives out there and are different points of views. Is that purge necessary now, or are people more informed?
People are more informed, but there also should be a purge as well when we hear Brian Stelter here in New York on CNN be aghast that Joe Rogan, a lot of people are following him. And likewise in my country, the disdain for the Fox News host Tucker Carlson for openly questioning why the United States should prefer Ukraine over Russia, and he's treated like a pariah. It shows you the lack of intellectual give and take in the upper echelons of mass media, much different from what we're doing right now. Look, if they're going to say that what I'm saying or Scott Ritter is saying is crock, you know what? If it's really so bad, you don't mudsling them and censor them. No, you have them on for an honest dialogue, because if your view is really right, then you should be able to cream them. But they know in their heart of hearts that's not the case.
It's brilliantly put, but they don't invite these people on. Michael, before we wrap up, tell me from where you stand how this plays out.
Okay, the only way Russia goes into Ukraine is if the Kiev regime launches a strike into Donbass. There are some people believing that by the end of February, they will go in and take the territory east of the Dnieper River. I respectfully disagree, because if they do that, that leaves a rump Kiev regime Ukraine, which is going to be more anti-Russian and also invites a greater NATO presence. I believe that the Russian endgame is that Kiev used to not be so anti-Russian, ditto Odessa, that in the long run, they can win back these areas. But it's going to be a long, drawn-out process, and certain things have to be put in place to do so. And that includes Russia not rocking the boat too much, unless they have to, because if the Kiev regime attacks, Russia's going to have to come in, and Kiev regime could lose some additional territory as a result.
Michael Averko, thank you very much for your time. This program is all about thinking differently. You certainly do. Thanks again.
Thank you for your time.